when other people ask us, well, what do you do? Or you tell someone, I'm writing a book, and they start asking those questions, it triggers all of that stuff within us. So I think that even happens from the very beginning. When you tell someone, I'm writing a book, oh, do you make money at that? And boom, there you go. You're triggered. And it's amazing how many times people will ask questions that you wouldn't necessarily ask anybody else in any other field.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indy Author podcast, I talk with Diane Vallere about combating and tapping into imposter syndrome, including how understanding personal goals and recognizing the difference between internal self-assessment and external comparisons can help manage imposter syndrome, the benefits for creatives of focusing on our own definition of success rather than external validation, and how pricing our work appropriately is crucial in avoiding the pitfalls of both imposter syndrome and undervaluation. And now let's hear from Diane Vallere about combating and tapping into imposter syndrome. Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author podcast. Today, my guest is Diane Vallere. Hey, Diane, how are you doing?
Good. How are you, Matty?
I'm doing great. And I would like to thank you for joining me again. You've been a pretty regular guest recently for a good reason, because the listeners love you. Yeah. And probably people are getting to know you now, but you actually sent me a slightly different bio for this episode, so I'm going to read it because it's a little bit new. Diane Vallere is the national best-selling author of over 40 books, including The Material Witness, Madison Night, and Killer Fashion Mystery Series. She edited the Agatha Award-winning essay collection Promophobia, taking the mystery out of promoting crime fiction, which you and I discussed in episode 199. And Diane majored in art history at the College of William and Mary and worked in luxury retailing before reigniting her love of fiction. And she currently lives in Pennsylvania, not far from me, where she spends her free time curled up with a book. And so I love talking with Diane about all things mindset. And Diane had actually suggested the topic of imposter syndrome, which I think is going to be very popular. Yeah. But I wanted to start out saying that as with this theory that all writers are introverts, like I think a lot of times we tend to lean too heavily on, oh, I'm a writer, so I'm an introvert, so I have these, these benefits and these detriments. Imposter syndrome seems like another one of those things that everybody assumes everybody experiences. And I'm not positive that's true, but I think it depends on what one's definition of imposter syndrome is. And I think that's something that people gloss over because we all just figure we know what it is. So, Diane, just talk a little bit about what you think of when you think of imposter syndrome.
Well, I think, first off, thank you for having me back. I love talking about these kinds of mindset issues and places where we psych ourselves out before we actually get out of the gates. But I think imposter syndrome really only happens when we are trying to do something that we don't believe we can do. And sometimes it rears its ugly head in the form of criticism we've heard somewhere throughout our lives. And we just carry that criticism around with us. Like we just hear somebody who told us once, maybe 10 years ago, like, you can't do that. And that pops into our head when we're trying to do something. No one ever experiences imposter syndrome when they know they can do something. So it really is because we have our own doubt about what we're trying to do. And our world in writing and in self-promo is so much that we have to toot our own horn. And a lot of people aren't wired to do that naturally. So what happens is you kind of have to pump yourself up to be able to do the promotion side of things. And that's when we start recognizing these little chinks in the armor, these little things like, I have to tell the world that my book is great, but do I think it's great? It's not as good as that person's, and it's not as good. And then all of a sudden, all that noise comes into our mind and we start thinking like, well, I don't have to tell anybody that it's not that good, but they might figure it out. But, and then it just all gets kind of triggered, and that's where it comes from. Yeah. That's what I think.
You talked a little bit about the idea of imposter syndrome when it comes to promoting our own work. And I wanted to back up a little bit, if you're willing, in talking about imposter syndrome just in our creative life, because I think sometimes that sort of paves the way to imposter syndrome in other areas. Is that something that you've thought through?
Yes. In fact, I think the root of it is really anytime we do something that we don't know we can do. And it can be if you have a job and you're paid for your job and you do your job, but you say you want to be creative. That's kind of an amorphous thing. And you might not know you can do it. You may have never earned any money doing it. And if that is your dream to be a full-time writer, then you're thinking about trading in this steady paycheck where you show up and work a set number of hours for this thing where you don't know how long it's going to take you to do. You don't know how long it's going to take you to make money. You don't know if you're going to make money, or What's involved in all of that? So there's a lot of question marks attached to that. And I think those question marks also start making us doubt whether we can do it. And that's where that self-doubt comes through. And because we feel those doubts, but when other people ask us, well, what do you do? Or you tell someone, I'm writing a book, and they start asking those questions, it triggers all of that stuff within us. So I think that even happens from the very beginning. When you tell someone, I'm writing a book, oh, do you make money at that? And boom, there you go. Your trigger, or whatever it might be. And it's amazing how many times people will ask questions that you wouldn't necessarily ask anybody else in any other field, but people do. They will say things like, can you live off of that? Or have you written anything I've read? Or is it going to be made into a movie? Or those kinds of questions, which are very broad, big questions, which we know when we're in this community, but we don't. The rest of the world doesn't necessarily know that's a big pool.
Yeah, I think that idea of using dollars to assess one's imposterishness or not, that if someone has put a book out there and they've made $1 million on it, then it's less likely, although I think not impossible, that they would be feeling imposter syndrome about that particular thing. But if you put a book out and you've made no money on it, then it encourages that feeling of, oh, well, no one's buying it, so it must not be worth anything.
Right. I do think it's so important that as we're on the journey, we understand what it is we want to get out of the journey, or what it is that's going to make us feel good about our work. I mean, we should feel good about our work just because we invested the time, we've invested the elements in it to make it the best quality it can be with the cover and the editing and the things like that. So that should be part of the process. But if we know that we want reviews, or we want to win awards, or we want a lot of readers, or we want a lot of downloads, and those are all specific goals. And if your goal is to be reviewed by a certain journal, but your book is free and you're getting tons of downloads, you might have a disconnect, and you might not feel good about your book because you're saying, they're not reviewing my book. Well, you haven't taken the steps to get that book reviewed. So you really do need to know what it is you want that's going to feed that part of you that needs the reassurance, and set your goals accordingly on that path.
It does seem as if very closely tied to imposter syndrome is comparisonitis, the other thing that all creatives are supposed to be experiencing. I mean, obviously not recommended to be experiencing, but just experience de facto. And I find that for both of these things, it's very specific. It's very circumstance specific for me. So there are certain areas that I would almost never feel imposter syndrome about. But actually, I'm realizing this. I'm saying this out loud. I'm realizing that the distinction I'm making is imposter syndrome is how good I feel about it myself, which I think is what you were saying before. And comparisonitis is how am I stacking up against the people in the external world. So it's that internal assessment and external assessment. And the worse you are assessing yourself in a comparisonitis idea, then the more that's feeding into the imposter syndrome that you're feeling internally. Does that make sense?
It does. I do think comparisonitis is a big problem in terms of imposter syndrome, because we are mainly working by ourselves, and we're looking for some sort of sense that we're on the right track. So what do? We look at other people who are doing what we're doing. And I know I was going to talk about introverts versus extroverts, because I think that plays in here. It goes back into comparing ourselves to other people. And we don't really know the story behind anybody else's journey. Someone can look more successful than us, but we don't know what they're doing promotion-wise, who they know, how much they've invested, how long they've been doing it. There's so many things we don't know. And sometimes people are very forthcoming with their information, and sometimes people aren't. And so that also makes it difficult to do that comparison. But because we spend so much time by ourselves, I think it's very natural just to think, am I on the right track? What's this person doing? Because it looks like their books are similar to mine. And that kind of then thing off.
Yeah, and all that information that would enable you to make a more dispassionate assessment. Hopefully nobody's walking up to people at a conference and saying, so how many books did you sell last year? Although maybe they are. But you never know. Like every once in a while, I'd have this insight into a colleague where I've heard somebody say, oh, I'm getting tons of engagement on Facebook or something like that. And I was like, whoa, they're getting tons of engagement on Facebook. And then I might go on Facebook and I'm like, I don't know. In my scheme of things, that doesn't feel like a ton of engagement. Or they're saying, oh, I'm not doing anything on Facebook. And then I go on, I'm like, dude, you have like 500 followers and they're responding to every one of your posts. And so there's no way to gauge this completely subjective kind of PR flavored assessment that people are putting out there, because unless you go and do some research, like everybody can see how many followers somebody has on Facebook, but we're not probably going to be seeing how many books they're selling. It's hard to recalibrate.
Right. I fully agree with that. And I think that is one of the reasons why comparison game, really, you never win the comparison game, because we're either looking at somebody else's career as a checkpoint to see, are we ahead of them or behind them? Well, that's not good, because we don't know what got them to where they are. We don't know what their goals are. And if we gauge ourselves compared to someone else, we are never truly evaluating ourselves and our projects and our series and what we're going to do next and whether we need to course correct. And it's very easy. There's so many people writing these days that it's very easy to find somebody who's doing worse than you and someone who's doing better than you. And that doesn't tell you anything, though, because that's really just completely defining your path by other people, and really should define your path by yourself.
So how do you balance that with, well, is there a good side of that where you find someone who has what you want, you think, and let's just say it's somebody that's outside of your immediate sphere of influence. It's not like a fellow writer that you can, set up a Zoom call with and say, hey, can we talk about this? It's somebody aspirational, let's say. Do you think that there's ever a time when setting that person up as a goal to be pursuing is positive?
Yes, I do, actually. I think, first off, there's that kind of a little bit of a trigger, a good trigger. When you see somebody who has what you want, that kind of tells you something about what you want in the journey. And just going back to the example I made about, whether you want reviews or awards or unit sales or dollar sales or bestseller charts ranking, if you might be getting one of those things, and if it's not what you want, you're not satisfied and you still feel like you'll still feel imposter syndrome because you're not achieving what you want. But when you see somebody else who has something and you realize you want it, that is huge, because it tells you something about your own journey. It tells you what you want, and that gives you the information to now pursue that. And you can figure out what somebody else is doing. I mean, you can sign up for somebody's newsletter and see how often they send it. What kind of things do they talk about? How far in advance do they start to promote a book? How often do they put things on sale? So you can get ideas from those people, but it does help if you're doing that with the people who have the path that you want, instead of trying to do that with everybody, because you will quickly get overwhelmed if you're trying to do everything that everybody is doing.
Yeah, and I like that idea of looking at the people who are succeeding that aren't too aspirational, because you can imagine that if you really want to build up I'll use the perennial example, Stephen King. If you decide you want to build up like the Stephen King level of popularity, then Stephen King no doubt has a whole sort of machine behind him who's taking care of his social media and sending out emails. I don't even know if he does this stuff, but the big authors have a team of people who are doing this for you. So you could say, well, this is going to be my aspirational goal, and I see that they're blogging every day, so I'm going to blog every day. But you know what? They have like editors who are doing, helping them out or whatever.
Right. It is one of those things when you realize that something that someone is doing consistently, and then you say, oh, that person probably has a team handling that. So that person is probably not doing that thing. They're going to have the idea that thing needs to get done, but they can test that out. So it becomes aspirational to think, what could you offload to someone? What would you like to offload to someone? Yeah. So that definitely, yes, that's true. That there's a little bit of comparison there in what you have, the team you have working for you, or the team Stephen King has working for himself.
Yeah.
Yes. I know I mentioned triggers, and I wanted to kind of mention that again, because I think there are also the triggers that we get afraid of that bring up, we're talking about imposter syndrome, and there might be things that bring up that imposter syndrome. I'm actually a big fan of triggers, because I do think whether they feel good or bad, they are telling us what we want. So they are telling us what direction to go and what maybe we need to tackle in order to get through imposter syndrome. They're telling us the big thing, like, you don't feel good about your book because, and whatever that thing was that you thought, oh, I'm not good as that person in this category, that tells you, well, then that's where your attention should go, because fixing that problem will make you feel much better about your project.
That brings up this idea that there are the things that we can control as creators. And, obviously control is a big aspect of what makes indie publishing appealing to writers, not having to wait for a gatekeeper to say you're good enough. So we as indie creators have both the ability to and the responsibility for creating our books, putting them out to a high level of quality and so on. We obviously don't have control over whether people buy them or not. But there's this whole other aspect of things we don't control that is more sort of immediately apparent. Like, I'm going to use the book feature deal example. So,
Yes.
book feature deal, I'm sure everybody knows, but, you submit. It's very competitive, even more competitive these days because a lot of traditional publishers have discovered BookBub. And so now you're up against Stephen King and other people of that ilk. And it's very expensive, but if you do get a BookBub feature deal, often you can, really skyrocket your sales for a day or two at least. But if people get hung up on that, like, all my friends are getting BookBub feature deals, but I'm not getting a BookBub feature deal, how should people handle that kind of imposter syndrome creating situation?
Well, I do think one of the main things is to continue to submit. I think that's a big thing. And it does get disheartening. I mean, you get the rejection and you think, BookBub doesn't like me. And then you think they're dead to me. I'm never applying for a BookBub feature deal again. But if you never apply for it again, you're never going to get one. I mean, you have just really removed your chances of ever getting one if you stop applying. So you have to almost put that into the business part of you. It's no different than anything else that you're checking out. If you say, I have to do a post on release day to let the Facebook people know that I have a new book out, then I have to apply for a BookBub feature deal, or it just has to become almost automated. And the reward is in doing it, not in getting it or not getting it. So it's like, I did that. I get to apply for this because I have a book that is eligible for this, and you're taking those steps for it. Rejection, just like you said, in a traditional world, there's a lot of traditional publishing world, there's rejection and querying, and then editors rejecting things like that. But as indies, we know we are responsible for the covers and the editing and the content. But even when you think about acquisition from a publisher, that even is our job. We're actually responsible for the book that we wrote and saying, is it good enough? Is there a place for this book in the market? And I think, most of the time we put the time into writing the book. Obviously, we feel like the book is going to go into the market because that's a lot of time spent. But sometimes we are that last line of defense that says, like, it's actually not good enough, or maybe it could be better, or yes, it's finally done, whatever that might be, so that when we're applying, we can feel better about telling BookBub, here's why you want to take this book. Because you remember, we all have goals. Well, BookBub have goals, and their goal is to grow their audience. So they don't want to put books in front of people that they don't think people are going to want to get. So we need to be in the middle of the genre. We need to be the best, reviews and presentation as possible. And if it's a little murky, we're probably going to get passed over. It doesn't mean our book isn't good, but there were other books that fit their audience better. So I think, again, it's in terms of those things, we just have to thicken our skin and know that's part of doing business. And we just need to apply for those things, even though we maybe have gotten rejected in the past.
Yeah, the two things that makes me think of is I always love an opportunity to share this perspective. And that is that to get these opportunities, quality is necessary, but not sufficient, in the sense that the story I like to share is having judged the Writer's Digest short fiction conference for several years. They get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of submissions, and there's going to be one winner. And I have read hundreds of excellent short pieces of short fiction, any of which would have been well worthy of giving that recognition to. But there's one slot. And so the people who are writing those hundreds and hundreds of worthy works shouldn't feel bad about the quality of their work. It was just that for whatever reason, that one was the one that caught the most judges' attention, or whatever that might be. It was maybe addressed a topic that was top of mind with the people who were assessing them, or if it's an agent, maybe it fills a slot that person just talked with their boss that morning about needing to fill. So so many things outside the quality of the work to consider. And then the other piece of advice that I'm channeling from my friend Michael Aran is that rejection should be transactional, not emotional. And we talked about
very good advice.
Yeah, in the context of applying for speaking engagements and not getting them. And there are 1,000,001 reasons other than whether you're a good speaker that you might not get a speaking engagement. And this is easier to say than do sometimes, but consider it to be, recognize it as the transactional decision it is, not a personal judgment. And I think that it is easier said than done sometimes, but it makes it much easier to swallow when you just realize all the other considerations that organizers or agents or contests or book club is factoring in.
It's true. And there's so many things we can't control. If there's a contest, we can't control if 5 people enter the contest or 5,000 people enter the contest. And there's going to be different results based on those 2 scenarios. So all we can control is whether we enter the contest. If we submit our work for whatever it is to get feedback for, or get, possibly win something, get recognition. And that's going back to the book club featured deal thing. Every time we submit, it's like we're telling ourselves, my book is good enough to be considered. You can't make them take it. You can't control how many other people submitted it. And there might be, every single day, there might be, 10,000 people submit a book for book club. And there might be one day that 4,000 submit, or some wonky number that doesn't fit their averages. But you don't know what's happening there. You don't know when it's the right thing. You don't know when somebody pulled their book out at the last minute and they need to scramble and they need to book, and your book is the right book at the right time and you're going in. So I think you just have to stop assuming that they said no because you're not good enough, because that's the imposter syndrome telling you're not good enough. And you have to say, I am good enough. I'm submitting because I believe I'm good enough. And it's an affirmation sometimes. It's just doing it enough times that you then start to just know, yes, I'm good enough to apply for this. Yes, I'm good enough to apply for that.
Yeah, the book club example I like to use is that I'm surprised how often, as a recipient of book club emails, they'll have one on psychological thrillers, and every one is a cover that has a blue and teal color scheme with yellow sans serif title and serif font author name. And it's very fun from a book cover design nerd point of view, but also, somebody probably just thought it would look cool to have a whole bunch of books that look very similar as a reader scrolls through it. Well, but if you didn't pick blue and teal with yellow and serif and sans serif, that could be the reason. It could be as silly as that.
Exactly. I mean, one time I submitted a book for a book club featured deal, and it was because it was around Halloween and the book cover was orange. And I put that in the comments and I said, I'm submitting a book because it's orange and black and white on the cover and it's Halloween, and I thought it would be timely. And I got an international book club featured deal. And I thought, it was book 11 in the series. Nothing to do. But, again, there are other considerations that go into these decisions.
It's so funny.
You got to get creative.
Yes, you do. That's going to be our next conversation, how to get creative in those ways. But I think that if somebody is listening to this, then a message they might take away, and I don't think it's the message we intend to send, is that I better be absolutely sure that my work is going to qualify in all these different areas. And if I just work on the cover another month, if I just work on the plot for another year, I can see that it could lead to analysis paralysis or perfectionist paralysis. What are your thoughts about that?
It could, but I do think we're held to the standard that we set for ourselves. And I mean, are there books out there that are written better than ours? Sure. Are there books out there that are written worse than ours? Sure. Are there books out there that have better covers than us? Sure. Are there books with crappy covers? Sure. And so knowing that, you start to realize there's a very wide assortment out there. We just need to be the best we think we can be. So we want our brand to be strong. We want to present a professional product because we are all the hats. And that, I think, is a lot of where imposter syndrome can come from, because if you wanted to be a writer, you understood that you wanted to tell a story. So writing the book and telling the story is kind of the core thing for us. And a lot of people do spend time on craft. They spend time, getting feedback, getting manuscripts flops, or getting an editor, things like that. But depending on all the other things, maybe you don't know graphic design. And so you might not know that your cover isn't good. And that's kind of where you might be falling down on the job because you're thinking that you can do everything and maybe you shouldn't be doing everything. And there's a lot of places where you can buy pre-made covers and you can study the market. Like you said, see all the thrillers that have the same color palette and you start to realize, wow, every single thriller seems to use a sans serif font. I have a curly font on my cover. Maybe that's not the right font for a thriller. So you start to notice what doesn't work and things like that. And you can study and you can get better about that. But there are times when it makes sense to hire somebody out who is good at that particular thing. So I think we can feel like imposters because we're trying to do all the jobs. And some people are wired to do all the jobs and some people aren't. And both of those are totally fine. I am one of those people who likes to learn everything about the process. So I may not be the best person to answer this particular one, but you start to read books with an eye for different things. You start to read books with what font are they using? How is it formatted? What goes on the copyright page or things like that. Vellum I've mentioned Vellum before. It's a great program for making things look professional. So just that, it cleans up a lot of things. It formats very well without having to put a lot of thought into it. But there are ways to read like a publisher. We always talk about, you read like a reader, and then when you start writing, you read like a writer. But there are ways to read like a publisher and start to notice different things and then evaluate your book that way. And that's one way to kind of catch things. You could also ask someone else to do that for you and just say, tell me, you have kind of thick skin for this, but tell me what's not up to par and kind of go from there with their feedback. Maybe find a friend and swap with a friend because you know that you'll both be gentle with the feedback. And just say, the goal is to have the best product that I can have. Same with you. So let's help each other out here.
Yeah, I found that the benefit of having dipped my toes into the water, many aspects of the publishing process, even if I didn't stick with it, is that I understood what the expert was doing. So I like playing around with Canva. I like making mock covers. I still rely on an actual person to do my covers, but I understand, if I'm asking for this item, I sort of understand whether that's a lot of work or a little work. If the result I get is, reasonable, or I should appeal it. I've mucked around in Facebook ads for a while, and to the extent that I kind of understood what all the levers were, but I obviously wasn't an expert at how to pull them. But then when I started working with someone who was, then we could have more intelligent conversations than if I had just given it all over. And I wasn't trying to fool myself into thinking I was an expert. But I also was recognizing that I was not an imposter because the knowledge I was bringing to those interactions was legitimate, even if it wasn't as sophisticated as the person I was working with.
I think that's a really interesting thing to mention also in terms of ads and hiring someone to do something. I think we have a tendency to think that somebody out there knows more than us. So we might hire someone to do something that we already know how to do. And we might think by default, well, they are charging for this, so they are an expert and they know more than me. And that might not be the case. And a lot of times we do know more than we think we know. And I think we touched upon that in one of our other discussions. But this is a case where when you know how to do something, you can have a good conversation with the person you've hired to handle that for you. But it also helps to reinforce that you shouldn't feel like an imposter in some cases because you may be better at something than you think you are.
Mm-hmm. Maybe a good way to close this out. Here's a very practical, hopefully this will be a very practical tip for people to hear. And that is that I think that one of the effects of imposter syndrome for indie authors is how they price their works. What you were saying before about, you respect somebody because they're charging for it. Maybe you undervalue your own knowledge in it. But I think that a similar thing works for readers, that if they see a book that's selling for $1.99, they kind of think it's worth $1.99. And I recently increased the prices of my books, my novels, from $4.99 to $6.99. I wouldn't discount doing that again in the near future. And I think that if you're putting out a book that is comparable in quality to the books that are $11.99, then Maybe I should be charging $11.99 for it. What do you think about that?
I agree with you 100%. I think there was a time when indies were pricing very low free books and 99-cent books. And it was good for getting in front of people. They were really early. There were different royalty pays. And so that definitely helped. And it goes partially to knowing what you want to get out of something. If you are pricing your book free or 99 cents, you want to get it to the maximum amount of people, and your goal might not be sales in dollars. It might be a new audience, introducing a new audience to your work. But I do think longer term, there is a quality attachment to price. And I think readers see things that are $2.99 even, and they think, it's not the same as this other thing over here. And you don't want your decisions to be going against you. And I think that's a case where you might be thinking, well, if I keep it cheap, then people are going to buy it because it's going to look really good. And $2.99 is a really great price point, and they're just going to grab it. But what's happening on the other side is someone saying $2.99, that can't be that good, because if it was good, it would be $6.99. So I'm going to move on to something else. We do need to price our books accordingly. And I mean, I know traditional publishing goes even higher than $11.99 for an ebook, and royalty pay being what it is, I think most indies kind of stay around like under $9.99. Yeah. But I agree with you 100%. That is a place where we should be evaluating our work from a quality level and making those decisions based on what we've put into it and where we think it fits in the market.
I like that sort of double-sided assessment tool where if you're wanting to put your book next to whoever your aspirational model is, that you both have to say, I put together a book that can stand next to this other author, feel confident in the quality. And if you don't feel confident in saying that, then to step back and look and say, well, is there kind of a reason I'm feeling this discomfort? Because is there a quality issue here that I need to address?
I think so. I think we do need to be aware of those things. I think the knee-jerk reaction to fighting off imposter syndrome is to automatically tell ourselves, I'm good enough. So you start to feel you're not good enough. You say, yes, I am good enough. And then you just leave everything as it is. And maybe there is something there that you can do to elevate your work. I mean, I've been through multiple levels of it when I've looked at things and said, my formatting isn't good enough. My proofing isn't good enough. And, along a 12-year journey, you start seeing those things and you start thinking, maybe my covers aren't good. Maybe it's time for rebranding. And it's not a one and done necessarily. Sometimes it is a moving target, but constantly making sure that the reader is getting the best quality product, that's the goal. Yeah.
Well, Diane, as always, super fun to talk with you about all things mindset. And please let everybody know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
You can find me on Facebook or Instagram at Diane Vallere. I have a weekly newsletter called The Weekly Diva that you can sign up for at my website at dianevallere.com.
Great. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Diane. Imposter syndrome can affect anyone, especially creatives. How do you combat self-doubt in your artistic or professional journeys? I would love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a comment on YouTube. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.